Next, we're going to talk, albeit very briefly again, about the Renaissance, because the Renaissance is an important period kind of linking certain things about the Middle Ages into the Reformation era. I think there's a way in which we have some familiarity with the Renaissance. Of course, Renaissance art is very beautiful. And you can teach entire courses on just the Renaissance. But we're going to just highlight a couple key things here very briefly. The word itself means rebirth, and it was the opinion of some that Europe, the West, had kind of fallen into a kind of dark time. And again, this is one of the periods where the term Dark Ages takes hold. Petrarch will, talk about coming out of the Dark Ages. And the rebirth was directed at recovering ancient civilization, Greek and Roman civilizations. And so it was the hope that, by going back to the glories of ancient Rome and to some extent ancient Greece and recovering the best of those civilizations and incorporating them into the present day, there would be kind of a rebirth of Western civilization. It was also, again, a transformative time for Europe. I mean, culturally, we'll see a lot of developments, but nationalism, national identity continues to develop. Law continues to develop, and maybe most importantly, we're entering a period of some sustained economic development. And again, not to overstate it by our standards, it wasn't like a booming period, but it was a time when the certain trade routes picked up and commercial activity was increasing. And so all these things contribute to the distinct contribution of the Renaissance, and then sort of towards the end we'll see the advent of the printing press as a way of spreading a number of these ideas. The focal point of the Renaissance was, of course, in Italy, and particularly in Florence, and there were a number of great benefactors and supporters, patrons of the arts. Florence was the chief city in the region of Tuscany, and it was sort of medium-sized, and yet it kind of contributed more than its fair share of culture and achievement. The Medici family, through several generations, were great patrons of the arts. Also were involved in economic activity. The family fortune was due to their involvement in banking as well as in various merchant trades. Lorenzo the Magnificent was also a key member of the Medici family. You see his dates on the outline. He died in 1492. He was a very wealthy guy. Was the grandson of Cosimo de' Medici, the patriarch. I'm sorry, he was the grandson of Giovanni de' Medici, whose son was Cosimo, and then Lorenzo was the grandson. And Lorenzo was kind of the governor of Florence during his adult life, and yet at the same time he was sort of a poet and benefactor of arts and learning. So it was kind of a grand age for these leaders to be benevolent rulers or seemingly benevolent rulers while patronizing high culture and the development of culture. Over the course of time, the Medici family would be, descendants of the Medici family would become cardinals, a number of cardinals. 2 popes were Medicis, and 2 Medici women became queens of France. So clearly a family with a lot of influence on the history of Western Europe. In the Renaissance, we see what's sometimes called a new conception of life. the world was starting to open up in some ways. It seemed to be more exciting. All of the focus that we've seen in the past on the next life and eternity, because this world was so miserable, some of that starts to wane, and we see people saying, wait a minute, this life isn't so bad. Being involved in the world, having different activities and engaging in different kinds of cultural endeavors was seen as good. To be clear, this was certainly something that only appealed. This kind of new conception of life was very much an upper class socioeconomic phenomenon. But even the existence of those opportunities, wasn't always there for the elite in society in previous centuries. So we see the development of a worldview in transition where, for example, the individual takes on a greater and greater importance. Man is seen as able to accomplish great things, and there's this notion of virtue, which it kind of looks like virtue, but it spoke more to kind of this quality of being a man, or vir in Latin. And it really was about kind of the successful use of our human powers, whether it be art or in war or in politics. This was a way of kind of living successfully in the world and excelling in everything that one did. And this was kind of the prized characteristic of people in the Renaissance. Of course, this translates into the development of humanism, which is a word I think we've all kind of heard a lot about, or we see it in different places. In this context, in the Renaissance context, it really is speaking more directly to kind of the focus on the individual as a source of achievement, of using the powers that we have as humans to accomplish great things. So humanism, is a focus on the individual and achievement, which will be applied to a number of different areas, whether that's in politics or kind of science or theology, philosophy. And there are a number of people who kind of exemplify this, and we'll just mention them very, very briefly. Francesco Petrarca, or Petrarch, was one of the early examples. He, as we've said, coined the term Dark Ages, or is at least thought to have coined that term. He was trained in law and actually studied theology, thought about becoming a priest, but instead gave that up because he was much more drawn to kind of travel and beauty and kind of living a different kind of full life. He was a great fan of Cicero, but also St. Augustine. And so we see a kind of mixing of ancient Rome and kind of classical Christian sources in some of Petrarch's works and his influences. He also wrote literature that was kind of moving in the direction of what we might consider secular literature, not in the sense of secular as in like anti-religious, but just not strictly religious in its consideration. Secular meaning of kind of the age or of the world, and there wasn't very much writing that was done up to this point that was just kind of like popular literature. In the Renaissance, we see much more of this. Also, sort of another contemporary of Petrarch was Giovanni Boccaccio, who wrote, his famous work was called the Decameron, which were a series of stories that were both entertaining but also kind of morality tales. And again, this is getting to that point that the development a more popular literature, not just the Summa of Thomas or the sentences or these theological works, but works meant to be read and circulated and just be much more accessible. It's not that they didn't ever exist, after the Roman Empire and then prior to this time, but it just wasn't a common feature, and so we see more and more production of this kind of thing in the Renaissance. Lorenzo Valla, we actually encountered Lorenzo Valla in a sense in a previous lecture when we talked about the false donation of Constantine. Remember that the discovery that a particular document that was thought to have been Constantine giving land to or territory to the Pope was discovered to be a forgery, and Valla was able to arrive at this conclusion because of what we might call textual criticism or historical criticism. He had been a really great student of Latin and had studied the history and development of words and when words came into use or how the spelling of words changed and all of this kind of stuff. And because of his knowledge of expressions and usage of words, he was able to determine that it could not have been written in Constantine's time and therefore was a forgery. There's also kind of a philosophical renewal that takes place during the Renaissance. Two figures that exemplify this you see on your outline are Marsilio Ficino and Giovanni Pico della Mirandola. They both were trying to incorporate truths of philosophy into kind of a more standard Christian understanding of truth. So Ficino, for example, sought to find truth in the works of Plato and kind of interpret Plato in light of the Christian tradition. I mean, there are ways in which Plato, as we've said, influenced the Christian theological concepts, but now Ficino goes back and looks at Plato and says, well, how is he expressing kind of ahead of his time certain Christian truths? Pico della Mirandola was kind of known for his search of what he called pristine theology. And this was, his endeavor to look at various cultures, not just Greek and Rome, but Greek and Roman, I should say, but even in the East and all around the world, whatever he could get his sort of hands on from ancient cultures. He thought there was kind of a original theology that preceded Plato, preceded Aristotle, maybe going back to kind of ancient Egypt or somewhere in there, that would kind of help unify all of these different world religions, if you will, to the extent that they were aware of the different religions of the East and things like that, that there was this kind of beginning point from which everything flowed. A similar endeavor actually happens with language, and is very interesting during this time and even moving forward into the 16th century and beyond. There was this sense that somewhere in the East, probably, they thought maybe China had the best chance of containing this. There was this most ancient language from which all languages were developed, and they could just recover this most ancient language. It would kind of unlock all the other languages, and we'd see how they were all connected. Of course, education was another element in the Renaissance that was important. Humanism, sort of implies that people will be educated, will have some sense of knowledge about whatever area they're focusing on. The development of what we think of today as secondary education, was really boosted during the Renaissance. We saw the development of universities in our last class, and so now this is increasingly they're formalizing the process of education to prepare men for universities. It was kind of the beginning. Medieval education didn't really delineate what we would think of as grade levels or anything like that. kind of just threw everyone together. The Renaissance starts to group people by age and knowledge level. And so that secondary structure is certainly a step forward. There's a great study of rhetoric, and learning, classical languages was very important. There was also an increased emphasis on the development of what we would call manners. In the Middle Ages prior to this time, even among the kind of upper classes, there were very few social conventions. They kind of acted like big kids, big children. They would spit and burp and blow their noses with, in very kind of crude ways, eat food with their hands. I mean, all the stuff that we probably do when no one else is around. And they were incredibly prone to fighting with each other, physical confrontations, just not acting in a way that we would sort of find civilized or polite. And so now in the Renaissance, we start to see books of etiquette and books on polite behavior. And there's this example, the Book of the Courtier by Castiglione, who is trying to put into print some of these conventions, that the courtier, or the man of the princely court, should be kind of well trained. He should move gracefully. His clothes should be neat, and he should be able to do a number of things well, but not be obnoxious about it. So these are considerations we don't often think about, but are sort of, it's interesting to see how they come about during this time. The political developments, the main one we should highlight is Machiavelli and the Prince. I mean, one of the fascinating things about the Renaissance is that for all of its great accomplishments, it didn't really produce a lasting political institution. I mean, there's no new form of political rule that arises during the Renaissance that takes hold. At various times, Florence was a republic, and then at other times, it was kind of a one-man rule situation, oligarchy, whatever it was. There weren't really any lasting contributions that came from it in the political realm. But Machiavelli makes a really important contribution with his work on statecraft, or kind of political life, if you will, with the Prince. It's often called the first secular treatise on politics. And again, what we mean by secular is not in our context of, a-religious or non-religious, anti-religious, but just he's treating politics from a perspective that's not rooted in theology. So, in Aquinas, he talks about politics, and he frames it as, divine authority and God's will for the government of men, and, how divine justice factors in and all of this stuff. Machiavelli wasn't really interested in kind of that theological underpinning. His treatment of politics was much more focused on what did rulers actually do. And he was, in a sense, not that concerned with questions of good and bad. He was just trying to be descriptive and evaluate how politics works. And his conclusion, which, in some ways, some of it's hard to argue with, right? His conclusion is that basically rulers, at least most of them, act according to their own political interest. They keep promises or they break them. They follow treaties or they violate them. They're merciful or they're ruthless, peaceful or aggressive, depending on what they think is politically necessary or politically expedient. Thank goodness that we've moved past those times. He was prepared to admit that this kind of behavior was bad, that being calculating and breaking promises, that was bad. But he was saying, this is just the way successful rulers behave. So it wasn't like he didn't have any kind of moral evaluation of it. He's just saying, look, if you want to understand how people are successful, what makes a successful prince, if you will, you have to understand that this is how they act. Some people thought it was too cynical, but there's a way in which many people thought he was onto something. In the arts, this is the area where we could really spend a lot of time, and I'm not going to spend, frankly, any time at all. We should mention, figures like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo. The sculpture as an art form certainly comes back into prominence and depicting. What do we think about when we think about Renaissance sculpture? We think about an accurate description, or a depiction, of the human form. And it's no coincidence that the human form was such a popular subject. This is the influence of humanism. And so you have, the famous sculpture of David or whatever it may be. And Da Vinci, of course, was kind of this brilliant mind in addition to being a great artist. He studied, nature extensively and had plans for bridges and submarines and all sorts of different things. Turning now to the Renaissance papacy, just briefly to highlight, there's a way in which we also think about the Renaissance popes as kind of a dark period for the standards of conduct among popes, and I think that's more or less fair, as we'll see here in a second. The Renaissance popes, though, by which I just mean the popes during this period we call the Renaissance, they faced a number of challenges that made it difficult for them to overcome. One was they just faced weakening, the problem of weakening authority for the Pope. Certainly, the Great Schism and the Conciliar movement were not helpful in this regard. The popes are trying to reclaim their authority over and against the councils, but it had been certainly diminished by what had happened previous to that. But probably more importantly was the development of just the other kind of nation states across Europe and the rising political power possessed by those kings made the Pope less of a political factor. I mean, he's still a major player, don't get me wrong, but he's facing increasing challenges in the face of that. The popular conception of the Renaissance papacy is one of kind of extravagance and immorality and this lavish patronage of the arts but tied to all sorts of immorality, and there's certainly something to that. But there are other ways in which we can round out the picture of maybe some important contributions that were made. The first pope to look at is Nicholas V. He basically realized that political peace and stability was going to be very important for the long-term success of the church and of the Pope. And so he makes a number of alliances to bring about a relative period of peace in Italy. And related to that, the physical restoration of Rome was a major priority of Nicholas V. Fixing up a number of churches, beefing up the infrastructure. He planned a renovation of St. Peter's. He founds the Vatican Library. And just a side point, it's a fascinating question that comes up during this time. When the Pope says we're going to have a library and we're going to keep all these great works here in the Vatican, a number of people said, well, should there be works by pagans? The ancient Greeks and the Romans were not Christian, obviously. And some people said, no, this is the literature of the damned and it shouldn't be included. However, Nicholas was much more accepting of this kind of thing and thought there could be contributions that, some truths that could be learned from them. And I think that was very representative of the mindset of kind of cultured class during the Renaissance. Nicholas V is also present during is also Pope during a great Jubilee year, which was declared in 1450. And he did this to try and show the restored unity of the church and the sort of peace that had been established after the Great Schism and Conciliarism. And it was actually quite successful. Jubilee years in this period, the previous one had been in the year 1300, so they're few and far in between. But there were special indulgences attached to making the pilgrimage, and so a number of people would come to Rome. And we saw it to some degree during the Jubilee Year of Mercy, but I'm not sure that it impacts people today the way it would have in the Middle Ages or in the Renaissance. And so there were huge crowds who came to Rome in the Jubilee year of 1450. And this, of course, meant a tremendous amount of income for the city of Rome and for the Pope. And it was also a positive sign of papal authority. After Nicholas V, we have Sixtus IV. And he made a number of his family members cardinals and appointed them to other important positions. It looks like 6. There's some contention as to the exact family relation for 2 of them, but it looks like 6 of his nephews were made cardinals. Others had married into important families. So the nepotism that we saw previously is really booming in the Renaissance. Also a kind of culmination of the papal patronage of the arts. This great lavishness under Sixtus IV. His coronation tiara, when the Pope was made Pope, it used to be crowned. And this tiara, he spent more than 1/3 of the papacy's annual income on the tiara. So just the crown cost a little bit more than 1/3 of the annual revenue that the Pope received. So it was pretty expensive. Of course, we are most familiar with his contribution to the arts because of the chapel that he wanted to have decorated and painted, the Sistine Chapel. Sistine is just the adjectival form of Sixtus. Although under him, we sort of just start with the sides. And the side walls, it's fascinating. If you've been there, you maybe, sometimes it's hard to see or whatever, but if you have a chance to look at them and spend some time, a lot of the things depicted are meant to show kind of papal authority, show the popes in a positive light. Next, we have Alexander VI. Alexander VI was a member of the Borgia family, kind of a notorious family that now we have a lot of knowledge of. I'm not familiar with that series that was on about the Borgias, but just the sense of this is a kind of a scheming, dark family there's something to that for sure. So Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia, was probably the most notorious of all Renaissance popes. He's said to have flaunted his mistresses around the Vatican and poisoned opposing cardinals. It's rumored that he was rumored to have had at least 9 illegitimate children. Prior to becoming pope, it certainly looked like he bribed his way into the papacy by kind of bestowing different appointments and titles on people in exchange for their votes. There's this famous story that he invited all of these prominent women in the city of Rome to a party in the papal gardens, but none of their husbands or brothers could attend. All sorts of debauchery ensued. That is there's no evidence for that. It's incredibly unlikely that something like that would have ever happened. So some of the stories about Alexander VI are probably illegitimate and were probably spread by his detractors, his enemies. The idea that he bribed his way into the papacy, for example, the problem with that is, yes, he had a lot of titles, he had a lot of positions, but it was generally accepted that upon becoming pope, one had to give them up, and just be pope. You weren't going to be the pope and the Archbishop of Milan or something like that. And so you had to give away your other titles, and so part of the distribution of those was just standard activity that a new pope would do. And then, of course, on the personal side, he seems to have lived a very kind of simple, pious life in many ways. He was, observed kind of in regular prayer, had a kind of structure to his day that he followed. He kept a very simple diet. It's one of these kind of confusing cases. There's no doubt that he was involved in an incredible amount of impropriety and did have a number of illegitimate children. I mean, that's not to say that that's not true, but some of the most excessive portraits of him probably overstate some of that. One of his children was Cesare Borgia, and he's probably the model for Machiavelli's prince and his ruthlessness. And then last, we should look at Julius II, who was pope from 1503 to 1513. And he's a good example of this problem that I was just kind of mentioning, what's called pluralism. Not pluralism like we think of it today, but like having plural or multiple titles or offices in the church. And so, because these were kind of treated as like prizes, you could acquire a number of them. So prior to becoming pope, here is Julius II's resume, if you will. And this is all simultaneously. He was the Archbishop of Avignon and Bologna, so he was the Archbishop of those two cities, but also the Bishop of Lausanne, Coutances, Viviers, Mende, Ostia, and Velletri. And he was the abbot of a number of monasteries. So he was, Archbishop of two dioceses, bishop of 5 or 6 other dioceses, and the abbot of several monasteries all at once. So this is the problem of pluralism. And of course, he can't be in all those places at once. And this is the kind of corruption and abuse that was going on that definitely caught the attention of many people, including the reformers. Under Julius II, we also see the beginning of a rebuild of St. Peter's Basilica, which will take into the 17th century to complete. But also under Julius II, he was a great patron of many of the high Renaissance artists, Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, Raphael. So there's a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles joke in there, I know. The Sistine Chapel ceiling under Michelangelo was commissioned. And so the Renaissance popes, certainly known for their contribution to the arts, certainly known for some of their excesses, but there's a way in which they were also kind of recovering from the aftermath of conciliarism and trying to stabilize the papacy as an institution. The Renaissance eventually spreads to Northern Europe and other parts of Europe from just kind of being focused on Italy. And interestingly enough, the Northern European Renaissance was much more influenced by a kind of Christian humanism, if you will. So yes, there was a kind of humanist turn in the Northern European Renaissance, but it was much more a kind of Christian humanism, where instead of looking so much at the Greeks and the Romans, they would look at the Hebrew and Greek texts of the Bible alongside the early church fathers. And so they weren't as enamored with kind of classical Roman civilization. They were much more interested in the patristic writings and things like that. The Northern European Renaissance also saw a great boom of higher education basically in the 15th century, between 1386 and 1506, so just over 120 years. 14 universities were founded just in Germany, basically in the Holy Roman Empire. And so there was a tremendous growth of learning. The epitome of the Northern European Renaissance, if you will, the best kind of figure, is Erasmus of Rotterdam. Erasmus was, a man of tremendous learning. He disliked the Middle Ages as kind of being backwards, but was deeply committed to Christianity and to sort of a reform of the church. He thought education was the key to moral improvement, and so he was big on kind of promoting different ways for people to be, to learn more of the necessary skills and knowledge to be good people, kind of a morality education, if you will. He prepared new Greek and Latin editions of the New Testament and wrote a number of different commentaries. He thought that some of the excesses of the Renaissance that people had seen, the kind of worldliness and ambition, were to be denounced and resisted. One of his famous works, In Praise of Folly, kind of is a satire of worldly pretension and ambition. And to be clear, though, the clergy were the targets in a number of instances of his criticism. He thought a number of priests and bishops were some of the worst offenders in terms of the worldliness and ambition. And for that reason, he was often quoted approvingly by the reformers, the Protestants, and yet there's a way in which Erasmus never got on board with the Protestant Reformation, and so he was critical of kind of the Catholics, and once the Reformation comes, he'll also be critical of the Protestants, and it makes him a kind of fascinating figure. Another work he wrote that was very important was called The Handbook of a Christian Soldier, which was a kind of practical manual to show how a person could take part in the affairs of the world while still remaining a devout Christian. And so for him, some of the ways in which the Renaissance was more secular, as we've been saying, he acknowledged that was a real thing, but didn't have to come at the expense of upholding Christian values, Christian principles. So, this is an important period culturally, politically, and for the church. We see some interesting dynamics, but the abuses and the excesses, continue to point to a need for reform within the church, and some of those, real problems that had been present for a long time and ultimately never addressed, set the stage for the Protestant Reformation.